Chapter 6 Preparing for the End. Shock and despair overwhelmed Daniel, who gasped at what was once a bustling village. He galloped his horse down off the mountain and roamed the streets that were now strewn with rubble. He looked around at houses that had been smashed open and torched, leaving only large cobblestone husks. Water flowed from the farms, where fertile land had been trampled beyond recognition. A straw hat, presumably belonging to a farmer, blew in front of Daniel on the dusty road. Daniel quickly dismounted and grabbed hold of it before the wind claimed it again. He turned it over, and in very polite handwriting was written the name Jerry. Blocky tears flowed from Daniel's eyes as he recalled the kind hospitality of his friend, who is now dead and his home likely reduced to ashes. Shoving the hat in his pocket, a sudden wave of anger swept over Daniel, and he drew his blade, veins straining and eyes bulging, as he screamed for the entity to come fight him, that he wasn't afraid, that he'd rather die than continue to witness the suffering of this condemned world. As if to answer his request, an all too familiar groan echoed from a nearby building. The building, like many others, was reduced to nothing but pillars and its cobblestone foundation, and Daniel observed something emerge from behind one of the pillars. It was a zombie. At least it was shaped like one. Daniel saw its skin crawling with the familiar code of ones and zeros, spilling across its entire body and flashing all at once. It had no face, but it seemed to perk at the presence of a person, and started its slow shamble toward Daniel. Against common sense, Daniel raised his sword and bellowed, "For Pisana!" and rushed the creature. He brought his sword down on its head, expecting to cleave it in two. However, that is not what happened. To Daniel's complete and utter astonishment, his blade went cleanly through the creature without affecting it whatsoever, as if he just swiped at some air. The force of the missed attack made Daniel spin around until he was face to face with the zombie. Without hesitation, the zombie slapped him with a big coated claw, sending Daniel flying 20 blocks back into a wall. Daniel's body exploded with pain. It hurt so bad. When he looked down, he realized he only had one heart left. Too injured to move, he watched in horror as the thing shuffled towards him. To Daniel, it almost seemed the creature was reveling in his pain, drawing satisfaction from it. It reached Daniel and raised its hands up high, giving a loud, mechanical chuckle. Daniel closed his eyes and braced for the worst when he felt a rush of air and heard a thwack from above his head. Daniel cracked open one eye to see an arrow occupying the space above his head, and the creature about to kill him was just as surprised as he was. Daniel peered around the creature to reveal James, with a bow in hand, who had a look of disbelief that his arrow had done nothing to hurt the creature. The creature turned from Daniel and rushed James suddenly. Daniel screamed, "Swords don't work!" as James pulled out his long broadsword and brought it down on the creature, this time lopping off one of its arms. The arm quickly dissipated into many particles. James quickly attacked several more times, swiping until the creature was gone. He walked over and helped his brother up. They embraced once again. Daniel asked, "How did you find me?" James said, "Well, I thought by your loud screams that you would head here and do something dumb. And I wasn't wrong. What was that thing, anyways?" Daniel suddenly recalled. It must be the work of that mysterious entity that's been destroying villages across the world. He's probably built up an entire army of these things, which are invisible to the conventional weapons we own. Daniel trailed off and saw James' sword, then saying, "Except for that." James looked down at his sword and said, "Oh yeah, I got this from the Nether a few in-game weeks before your arrival. It's made out of this new metal, I believe they call it netherite? Strongest material in the game, by the way, but we only have a few small quantities of it due to the strict policies of King Porkton of the Piglins, the guys that control the Nether. Say, we need to go right now and tell Ironfell to get his men prepared." Mounting their horses, they quickly traveled to the walled city and explained everything of their encounter to Ironfell. He took the news grimly, but quickly organized his armies and dug more trenches, constructed bigger and thicker walls, and armed as many as he could with netherite swords and bows. However, there simply wasn't enough netherite for all his men. After consulting with his war council, he knew that their only option was to get the approval of King Porkton to get more netherite. A meeting was arranged, and the three went to meet the king of the Piglins. After some intense negotiations, the king agreed to allow the village to attain larger quantities of the substance. When asked if they could have any extra support of the king's army, he refused. "I won't lay down any of my soldiers' lives for a cause we aren't involved in," the king snarled. Ironfeld calmly explained that this fight involved all the dimensions, because once the entity was finished with the overworld, where do you think he'd come next? The king was firm to his position, though, and the three left, slightly dissatisfied. At the same time as the meeting progressed, netherite was processed by the hundreds of blacksmiths of Tarsonis and melted down into swords, armor, bows, arrows, and shields. After weeks of frenzied preparation, the village was finally ready for the final battle. As the brothers surveyed the busy streets, James asked Daniel, "When do you think he'll come?" Daniel grimly looked out behind the wall and gestured to the gathering clouds. "I think he's here already." Chapter 7. The Coated Swarm. The clouds Daniel saw soon morphed into dark, black objects that covered the whole city, churning day to night. Villagers scurried about in the streets, some going to shelters, and others running for the barracks for their weaponry. Ironfeld screamed for the men to form a battle line on the north wall, and to hold position for further instructions. He walked up to one of the tall reconnaissance towers and used his telescope to survey the field. In the pouring rain he saw the figure, the mysterious entity that had caused so much death and destruction. He levitated above the ground, holding his hands in clenched fists, as if all this resistance was irritating to him. Suddenly, a very deep, metallic voice radiated out from the entity, projecting over the entire village. "Surrender now, feeble beings, or I will reduce this village to no more than ashes and lost memories. I'm sure you've seen my handiwork, so you know I'm not kidding." At this, the creature gave a deep, unsettling giggle as he remembered all of his ruthless acts. In unison, the village shouted, "We'd rather die than surrender to you, murderer." The entity sighed but simply said, "As you wish." His fist suddenly illuminated bright, and he reached out and shocked the clouds. Suddenly the rain stopped, and creatures of code began to rain from the heavens around the entity. Soon a considerable mass of coded warriors had gathered in front of the wall. Wherever you could call a face of the creature suddenly glowed bright white, and a high-pitched, metallic voice screamed, "You know the drill! No survivors!" The horde then rapidly approached the wall. However, the villagers were ready for them. Hundreds of archers stationed on top of the wall rained thousands of arrows upon the creatures. Dipped in netherite, the first wave quickly dissolved, with minimal damage to the wall. Cheers erupted from the battle line, but were quickly stifled by the tramples of the second wave, this one bigger than the first. This time, coated phantoms dived from the skies, carrying off or just straight up diving into the archers' positions, exploding when they reached them. Screams from the injured filled the air as the battle line crumbled in the phantom onslaught. The wall groaned as the bodies of hundreds of coated warriors pushed forth, trying to get in and destroy the inhabitants. As the battle line disintegrated, James and Daniel rode up to the chaos. Each of them rallied groups of retreating archers to hold the line. Bolstered by the arrival of the players, the archers returned fire to their flying foes. The wave of phantoms was soon extinguished, and the archers were able to lend support to those on the ground. However, it was at this moment that the wall was breached. A small hole opened that was considerably widened soon enough, and code monsters poured in. Ironfeld held a line of close-range fighters that only had enough arrows for a couple shots. Ironfeld waited until the monsters breached, and then unleashed a devastating volley on the approaching swarm. After a few seconds, he ordered yet another broadside. This killed many of the initial monsters, but did little to break their momentum. Ironfeld unsheathed a second sword, cursed in some language long forgotten, and then flung himself alongside his men into the thick of the fighting. At this point, there was no order or discipline. Every villager knew what they were fighting for, and they furiously hacked through many of these coded creatures. Many villagers fell, but they inflicted heavy casualties on the code monsters, who began to be driven back slowly but surely. Soon they were pushed back to the wall, but before the tide was fully turned, a large burst of energy blew a huge hole into the battle, vaporizing dozens of villagers and code monsters alike. It was the entity, clearly angry that these dumb villagers were putting up more of a fight than he anticipated. No matter, he would handle them himself. From his fingertips he flung more massive bursts of energy into the battle line, killing hundreds of villager fighters. Soon the whole army was in full retreat toward the inner fortresses of the city. Flames licked the sky as homes began to be torched. Daniel and James saw what was happening, and Daniel said, "We have to take him out, James." James replied with, "Are you crazy? Do you see what this guy can do?" Daniel ignored him and ran towards the outer parts of the city, against a stream of fleeing villager fighters. He emerged into a small clearing, where he saw the entity levitating. The entity regarded him curiously, as if knowing he was different, but deciding the matter wasn't of much importance. He would move, or he would die. Screaming a battle cry, Daniel leaped up and punched the entity in the face with his new netherite gauntlets, sending him reeling into a nearby building. The entity emerged greatly enraged, sending beams of code searing at Daniel, who leapt out of the way just as the beams vaporized a nearby herd of cows. Daniel continued his onslaught, punching again and again, damaging and killing the entity slowly. He had almost finished him off when James arrived, astonished at how good Daniel was doing. The entity and Daniel noticed him at almost the same time, but Daniel noticed only slightly faster. He screamed for James to duck as he dived towards him, just as the entity sent a beam of code energy flying at James. Daniel took the full brunt of the blast, being flung into a nearby wall and crumpling to the ground, unresponsive. James shouted, "Daniel, no!" and shook his brother, trying to get a response. The entity laughed a malicious laugh, while taking aim at the distracted and distraught James. Before he could do so, however, an arrow pierced his side. He howled and wheeled on his attacker, which was Ironfeld. Ironfeld leapt with both swords held high, plunging them both into the chest of the entity. The entity screamed a loud, awful scream of pain before hitting Ironfeld with a super powerful charge of energy. Ironfeld crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The entity oozed code from his various injuries as he drawled, "Is this the best you got?" To answer his question, an arrow flew from the smoke and right into the center of the entity's chest. This time, the entity fell to the ground and dissipated into the mist. Daniel said in a shaky voice, "Nope, this is," before dropping the bow and crumpling to the ground. James looked shocked at his brother, then also suddenly fell into unconsciousness. A green light, slowly growing brighter, filled the world around them, and then all went black. Air. Daniel opened his eyes and breathed. He breathed again and again. He looked at his hands, which were back to normal. On the other side of the small room lay James, equally as surprised as Daniel to be back. He said to Daniel, "That wasn't a dream, right?" Daniel pulled out of his pocket a small, pixelated straw hat, the one that belonged to Jerry. "No, James, no it wasn't." They both looked at the hybrid console, and then back to each other. A loud smash quickly filled the garage, as Daniel slammed his sledgehammer into the console. He smashed it to bits, and with the help of James, discarded the bits that were left. They stared at the trash bin for a moment, before James said, "Do you want to go play some Minecraft?" Daniel quickly replied, "Yeah, I think that'd be appropriate." They slung their arms together, as bros do, and went back to their house, putting behind the whole event and enjoying a nice, quiet evening of Minecraft together. The end? 101010101010101010.